Namaskar. Birth and spread of communalism in India. With the rise of nationalism, communalism appeared around the end of the 19th century. It proved to be a huge threat to the unity of the Indian people and the national movement. The legacy unfortunately continues. The characteristic features of Indian communalism. Communalism, more accurately sectarianism, is basically an ideology which gives more importance to one's own ethnic/religious groups rather than to the wider society as a whole. Evolved through three broad stages in India. One, communal nationalism, the notion that since a group or a section of the people belong to a particular religious community, their secular interests are the same. That is, even those matters which have got nothing to do with religion affect all of them equally. Two, liberal communalism, the notion that since two religious communities have different religious interests, they have different interests in the secular sphere also, that is, in economic, political, and cultural spheres. Three, extreme communalism, the notion that not only do different religious communities have different interests, but also that these interests are incompatible, that is, two communities cannot coexist because the interests of one community come into conflict with those of the other. There is nothing unique about Indian communalism. It was the result of the conditions which have in other societies produced similar phenomena and ideologies such as fascism, anti-Semitism, racism, the Catholic-Protestant conflict in North Ireland, and the Christian-Muslim conflict in Lebanon. Bypassing basic economic interests, the communalists claim to protect interests which do not necessarily exist. Communalism is a modern phenomenon rooted in the modern social, economic, and political colonial structure that emerged out of modern politics based on mass mobilization and popular participation. Modern politics made it necessary for people to have wider links and loyalties and to form established identities. This process involved the spread of modern ideas of nation, class, and cultural linguistic identity. In India, religious consciousness was transformed into communal consciousness in some part of the country and among some sections of the people. Its social roots lay in the rising middle classes who propagated imaginary communal interests to further their own economic interests. Communalism was a bourgeois question par excellence. According to the left, communalists were backed in their communal campaign by the colonial administration. It was the channel through which colonialists expanded their social base. Communalists and colonialists were helped in their sinister motives by the fact that often socio-economic distinctions in Indian society coincided with religious distinctions. The inherent class contradictions were given a post facto communal coloring by the vested interests. Conservative social reactionary elements gave full support to communalism. Religiosity itself did not amount to communalism, but in a country where lack of education and low awareness of the outside world was a sad reality, religion had the potential of becoming and was used as a beacon of communalism. Reasons for growth of communalism. Communalism grew in the modern economic, political, and social institutions where new identities were emerging in a haphazard manner, even as the old pre-modern identities had not diminished. A clash of this fundamental dichotomy gave rise to a communal ideology. Socio-economic reasons. Religion did not actually dictate the economic and political interests of the Hindus and Muslims. One community consisting of Hindus as well as Muslims differ from another, also consisting of Hindus and Muslims by language, culture, caste, social status, food and dress habits, so- social practices or customs, and so on. Even socially and culturally, the Hindu and the Muslim masses had developed common ways of life. A Bengali Muslim had much more in common with the Bengali Hindu than with the Punjabi Muslim. Moreover, Hindus and the Muslims were equal victims of oppression and exploitation by the British imperialism. Modern Western thought and scientific ideas were not absorbed by the Muslim intellectuals who remained tradition and backward, even when as a result of the efforts of reformers, modern education spread among Muslims. The proportion of the educated was far lower among Muslims than among Hindus, Parsis, or Christians. The Muslims also lagged behind as participants in the growth of trade and industry, as the number of educated persons and men of trade and industry among the Muslims was rather small. It was easy for the reactionary big landlords and the richer classes to continue to wield influence over the Muslim masses. Landlords and zamindars, whether Hindu or Muslim, supported the British rule out of the self-interest. But among the Hindus, the modern intellectuals and the rising commercial and industrialist class had taken over the leadership from the old order of landlords. The educated Muslims found new opportunities in business or the professions. They inevitably looked for government employment. British officials and the loyalist Muslim leaders inciting the educated Muslims against the educated Hindus. Sayyid Ahmad Khan and others demanded special treatment for the Muslims in the matter of government service. On the other hand, and on the other, told the Muslims that if the educated Muslims remained loyal to the British, the latter would reward them with government jobs and other special favors. The same arguments were used by some loyalists, Hindus and Parsis with regard to their people, but they were in a small minority. There has been a difference of a generation or more in the development of the Hindu and the Muslim middle classes, and that difference continues to show itself in many directions, political, economic, and other. It is this lag which produces a psychology of fear among the Muslims. Jawaharlal Nehru in the discovery of India. He who does what is beneficial to the people of this country. B. He who he who does this sorry he who does what is beneficial to the people of this country, be he a Muhammadan or an Englishman, is not an alien. Alienness has to do with interests. Alienness is certainly not concerned with Alienness has to do with interests. Alienness is certainly not concerned with white or black skin or religion. Bal Gangadhar Tilak is. As a result of the underdevelopment due to colonial policies, there was a lack of industrial development. Hence, unemployment was an acute problem in India, especially for the educated, and there was an intense competition for existing jobs. In the circumstances, there were advocates of short-sighted and short-term solutions such as reservation in jobs or on communal, provincial, or caste lines. These persons aroused communal and religious and later caste and provincial persons in an attempt to get a larger share of the existing limited employment opportunities. It was easy for those desperately searching for jobs for employment to fall prey to such ideas. Because of the economic backwardness of India and rampant unemployment, there was ample scope for the colonial government to use concessions, favors, and reservations to fuel communal and separatist tendencies. Also, modern political consciousness was late in developing among the Muslims, and the dominance of traditional reactionary elements over the Muslim masses helped a communal outlook to take root. There was talk of Hindu nationalism and Muslim nationalism, politically immature. Many Hindus as well as Muslims did not realize that the economic, educational, and cultural difficulties they were experiencing were born out of their subjection to foreign rule and because of economic underdevelopment. British policy of divide and rule. Muslims were generally looked upon with suspicion initially, especially after the Wahhabi and after 1857 revolts, and were subjected to repression and discrimination by the British government. Also, the introduction of English education had undermined Arabic and Persian learning, which added further to the economic backwardness and exclusion of the Muslim from service. After the 1870s, with signs of emergence of the Indian nationalism and growing politicization of educated middle classes, the government reversed its policy of repression of Muslims and instead decided to rally them behind the government through concessions, favors, and reservations, and used them against nationalist forces. The government used persons like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to counter the growing influence of the Congress. Syed Ahmad Khan had a broad-minded and reformist outlook initially, but later he started supporting the colonial governments, exhorting the Muslim masses to stay away from the Congress and not to get politicized. He also started talking of separatist interests of Hindu and Muslim communalism in history writing. Initially suggested by imperialist historians and later adopted by some chauvinists in Indian historians, and the communal interpretation of Indian history portrayed the ancient phase as the Hindu phase and the medieval phase, which included the rule of the Turks, the Afghans, and the Mughals, as the Muslim phase. The conflicts of ruling classes during the medieval phase were distorted and exaggerated as Hindu-Muslim conflicts. Communal harmony could not be permanently established in our country so long as highly distorted versions of history were taught in her schools and colleges through the history textbooks. Gandhi. Historians ignored the fact that politics, ancient and medieval, as of all times and anywhere, was based on economic and political interests and not on religious considerations. It was in the interests of the British and communal historians to refuse to acknowledge the notion of a composite culture in India. On its part, the Hindu communal view of history chose to project the view that the Indian society and culture had reached ideal heights in the ancient period, from which they began to decay in the medieval period because of Muslim rule. In this, there was a refusal to acknowledge how Indian economy and technology, religion and philosophy, arts and literature, culture and society had developed and been enriched in the medieval period. Side effects of social religious reform movements such as the Wahhabi movement among Muslims and Sufism among Hindu Jews with their militant overtones made the role of religion more vulnerable to communalism. Reforms at times were seen as a process of insulating one community from the influence of another religious community. Side effects of militant nationalism. The early nationalists made conscious effort to remove minority fears. Dada Banerjee, presiding over the Second Congress in 1896, declared the intentions of the Congress not to raise socio-religious questions in its forums. In 1889, the Congress decided. In 1889, the Congress decided not to take up any issue posed by the Muslims, but later, with the coming of militant nationalism, a distinct Hindu nationalist tinge was palpable in the nationalist politics. For instance, Tilak Ganpati and Shivaji festivals and anti-cow slaughter campaigns created much suspicion. Aurobindo's vision of an Aryanized world, the Swadeshi movement with elements like dips in the Ganga and revolutionary activity with oath-taking oath-taking before goddesses were hardly likely to enthuse Muslims into these campaigns in a big way. The communal elements in the Lucknow Pact 1916 and the Khilafat agitation 1922 was too visible to be of insignificant consequences. When the Khilafat question came up, there was unease among some congressmen who felt that the issue was not really nationalistic. The fight against imperialistic Britain in this case was not about the economic and political consequences of imperialism, but on the ground that the Caliph and some holy places of Islam were being threatened. The Muslim sympathy for Turks for the Muslim sympathy for Turkey was on religious grounds. Even later, the heroes and myths and cultural traditions that Muslims appealed to the Muslims the Muslims appealed to the Muslims appealed to the belonged not to the history of India but to the history of West Asia, though this tendency did not immediately clash with the Indian nationalism, but in fact made its supporters anti-imperialist in the longer term. It encouraged the habit of looking at political questions from a religious point of view. Communal reaction by majority community. The majority communalism, sorry, communal reaction by communal reaction by majority community. The minority communalism met with a reaction from the majority community from the 1870s itself. Some Hindu zamindars, moneylenders, and middle class professionals began to give expression to anti-Muslim sentiments. They went to the extent of declaring that the British had liberated the land from Muslim tyranny and saved the Hindus from the oppression by Muslims. The cause of Hindi was given a communal colour by saying that Urdu was the language of the Muslims, which was not historically quite correct. Then came organizations to promote a communal outlook. The Punjab Hindu Sabha, founded in 1909 by UN Mukherjee and Lal Chand, opposed the Congress for trying to unite Indians of all colours into a single nation. They argued that Hindus should side with the colonial government in their fight against Muslims. The All India Hindu Mahasabha held its first session in April 1915 with the Maharaja of Kashim Bajar as president. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh (RSS) was established in 1925. However, Hindu communalism was not a strong force for a long time, and the modern secular intelligentsia and middle class among Hindus wielded a greater influence. This was not the case with the Muslims. The Muslim communal elements, landlords, traditional religious leaders, and bureaucrats exercised a exercised a lot of influence on the Muslims. The one-upmanship of different versions of communal tendencies was a factor which which deterred any effective counter-offensive against communalism. Evolution of the two-nation theory. The development of the two-nation theory over the years is as follows. Evolution of the two-nation theory. The development of the two-nation theory over the years is as follows. 1887, there was a frontal attack on the Congress by Dufresne, the Viceroy, and Colvin, the Lieutenant Governor of the United Provinces. Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Rajiv Shiv Prasad of Bengal were propped up propped up as an anti-Congress front by the government. Sayyid Ahmad Khan appealed to the educated Muslims to stay away from the Congress, although some Muslims did join the Congress. These included Badruddin Tayyibji, Mir Musharraf Hussain Bhimji, and Hamid Ali Khan. 1906. Aga Khan led a Muslim delegation called the Simla delegation to the Viceroy Lord Minto to demand separate electorates for Muslims at all levels and that the Muslim representation should be commensurate not only with their numerical strength but also with their political importance and their contribution to the British Empire. Minto assured them of special communal representation in excess of their population for their extraordinary service to the empire. The All India Muslim League was founded by the Aga Khan, Nawab Salimullah of Dhaka, Nawab Muhsin ul Mulk, and Nawab Wakar ul Mulk to preach loyalty to the British government and to keep the Muslim intelligence away from the Congress. 1999. Separate electorates were awarded under parliamentary reforms. Punjab Hindu Sabha was founded by UN Mukherjee and Lal Chand. 1915. First session of All India Hindu Mahasabha was held under the aegis of the Maharaja of Kashim Bajar. 1912 to 1924. During this period, the Muslim League was dominated by younger Muslim nationalists, but their nationalism was inspired by a communal view of political questions. 1916, the Congress accepted the Muslim League demand of separate electorates, and the Congress and the League presented joint demands to the government, but the Congress and the League came together as separate political entities, and the Congress gave political legitimacy to the existence of the Muslim League. 1920 to 1922, Muslims participated in the Rowlatt and Khilafat cooperation agitations, but there was a communal element in the political outlook of the Muslims. 1920s, the shadow of communal rights loomed large over the country. The Arya Samajists started Suddhi purification and Sangathan organization movements. The Suddhi movement was aimed at reconverting to Hinduism those who had converted to Islam. The Muslims started the Tabligh and Tanjim movements in retaliation. Some Hindu nationalists also turned communal. The Swarajists were divided among communal lines, and responsive, many of the responsivists among them joined the Hindu Mahasabha. The Ali brothers, after having put up a spectacular united front with the Congress, accused the Congress of protecting only Hindu interests. The Congress failed to evolve a suitable strategy to counter the rise of communalism. 1920, the Nehru Report on Constitutional Reforms, as suggested by the Congress, was opposed by Muslim hardliners, and In the Sikh League, Jinnah proposed 14 points demanding separate electorates and reservation for Muslims in government service and self-governing bodies. By negotiating with the Muslim League, the Congress made a number of mistakes. One, it gave legitimacy to the politics of the League, thus giving recognition to the division of society into separate communities with separate interests. Second, it undermined the role of secular nationalist Muslims. 3. Concessions to one community pro- prompted other communities to demand similar concessions for launching an all-out attack on communalism because became difficult. Became difficult. For launching an all-out attack on communalism became difficult. 1934 to 1930 to 1934, some Muslim groups such as Jamaat-e-Ulema-e-Hind, State of Kashmir, Khudai Khidmat Guards participated in the civil disobedience movement, but overall the participation of Muslims was nowhere near the level of Khilafat agitation, while the Congress stayed away from the two of the three roundtable conferences held in London to discuss further constitutional reforms. The Communalists attended all three of them. 1932, the Communal Award accepted all Muslim communal demands contained in the 14 points. After 1937, after the Muslim League performed badly in the 1937 provincial elections, they decided to resort to extreme communalism. There began a tendency to project the Muslims not as a minority but as a separate nation. In the early 1930s, this idea of a separate Muslim nation was proposed by a young Muslim intellectual Rahmat Ali and later developed further by the poetic Iqbal. From now onwards, communalism was organized as a mass movement with its base among middle and upper classes. Vicious propaganda was launched against the Congress by J. A. Suleri, F. M. Durrani, Fazl ul Haq, etc. Extreme communalism was based on fear, hatred, and violence of word and deed. Till 1937, there had been liberal communalism centered around safeguards and reservations. It was communal while upholding certain liberal, democratic, humanistic, and nationalistic values, and the notion that these diverse communities could be welded together into one nation in one national interest. The extreme communalism of Muslims found its echo in the militant communal nationalism of Hindu represented by the organizations such as Hindu Mahasabha and RSS, and in the thoughts of leaders like Govalkar. There were several reasons for the advent of extreme communalism. One, with increasing radicalization, the reactionary elements searched for a social base through channels of communalism. To the colonial administration had exhausted all other means to divide nationalists. 3. Earlier failures to challenge communal tendencies had emboldened the communal forces. 1937 to 1939, Jinnah blocked all avenues for conciliation by forwarding the impossible demand that the Congress should declare itself a Hindu organization and recognize the Muslim League as the sole representative of the Indian Muslims. March 24, 1940, the Pakistan resolution was passed at the Lahore session of the Muslim League, calling for grouping of all geographically contiguous Muslim majority area, mainly northwestern and eastern India, into independent states in which the constituent units shall be autonomous and sovereign, and adequate safeguards to Muslims in other areas where they are in a minority. During Second World sorry sorry March 24, 1940, the Pakistan resolution was passed at the Lahore session of the Muslim League, calling for grouping of all geographically contiguous Muslim majority area, mainly northwestern and eastern India, into independent states in which the constituent units shall be autonomous and sovereign, and adequate safeguards to Muslims in other areas where they are in a minority. The question of majority and minority community is a creation of the British government and would dissipate with their withdrawal. M.K. Gandhi. We divide and they do. Maulana Muhammad Ali. After 1940, it was clear as daylight to the Muslims that their real destiny was neither a second-class citizenship in a uninational Hindu state nor even the doubtful partnership in a multinational India, but a separate nationhood with a separate homeland. History of freedom movement of Pakistan. The independent sovereign nation of Pakistan was born in the Muslim University of Aligarh, Aga Khan. During Second World War, the British India government gave a virtual veto to the League on political settlement. The League made full use of this privilege. During Second World War, the British India government gave a virtual veto to the League on political settlement. The League made full use of this privilege and stuck to its demand of a separate Pakistan throughout the negotiations under the August offer, crisp proposals, similar conference and cabinet mission plan. Finally, it got what it had aspired for: an independent Pakistan comprising Muslim majority areas of Pakistan, Sindh, Balochistan, Northwest Frontier Province and Bengal in 1947. धन्यवाद. Thank you so much.